The tinacle is quiet, but not still. Its walls breathe a humid living scent, ripe with the tang of fermentation, the sweetness of aguamiel, and the soft musk of old wood and clay. Vessels line the room like memory keepers, each seasoned by generations of pulque passed through their pores. A bowl is dipped, lifted. The liquid stretches slightly, silken and pale, alive with tiny bubbles rising in slow procession. You raise it to your lips. The scent is earthy, floral, faintly sour, like desert rain or cut agave after sun. Then you drink. Cool, thick, gently effervescent. Pulque blankets your mouth in soft silkiness, a liquid velvet woven from agave sweetness. Notes of tart apple, faint earthiness, and herbal echoes of desert flora. The taste seems to shift gently, teasing your palate with flavors both familiar and elusive, dancing fluidly between sweetness and acidity, grounded yet ethereal. It lingers, not just on the tongue, but in the body. A soft warmth blooms low in the belly. You swallow again and realize, this isn't a drink. It's a conversation between Maguey, microbe, and human hand. Ancient, ongoing, still speaking. Pulque, the ancient fermented beverage derived from the Maguey agave plant, stands as a testament to thousands of years of cultural and ecological co-evolution in Mesoamerica. Long before the introduction of European distillation methods, indigenous peoples of Mexico relied upon meticulous practices and precise ecological interactions to produce this unique, nutritious drink. Pulque was not simply a beverage, but held deep spiritual, cultural, and social significance, appearing in ritual contexts, ceremonial offerings, medicinal treatments, and daily sustenance across numerous indigenous cultures, notably the Aztecs, Mexica, and Otomi. The creation of pulque is inseparable from the intricate, structured logic of interdependent relationships. Across generations, Mesoamerican peoples observed, engaged with, and actively shaped the metabolic rhythms of Maguey plants, discovering and codifying an elaborate sequence of horticultural and microbial interactions. Each step, from carefully cultivated Maguey maturity to the practiced daily routine of harvesting aguamiel, the sweet, nourishing sap, and transforming it through fermentation, represents a disciplined alignment of human action and ecological response. Central to pulque production is a profound intimacy with microbial communities, agents unseen but deeply respected. Microbes residing in traditional fermentation vessels, the ambient environment, and even harvesting tools, guided by precise timing and careful human stewardship, bring forth the beverage's distinctive texture, nutritional richness, and mildly intoxicating qualities. Rather than being domesticated or industrialized, the microbial ecosystem of pulque has long existed as a partner, maintained, fed, and preserved by ongoing human attention and care. Pulque's resilience and continued existence today rely on a triadic logic of interrelation, complex patterns of coexistence, reinforcement, causality, convergence, harmony, and regeneration that bind plant physiology, microbial ecology, and human culture into a holistic system. When any of these threads unravel, whether through agricultural neglect, cultural marginalization, or microbial imbalance, the entire fabric of pulque production begins to fray. In exploring the nuanced practices that shape the initiation of aguamiel flow, the dynamic activation of fermentation, the stability and ecological memory of the tinacle fermentation space, and the mindful co-creation of pulque's distinctive sensory qualities, we reveal the pulque system not merely as traditional knowledge or biochemical transformation, but as a living, adaptive, homeostatic entity. It thrives precisely because it is sustained by collective human wisdom, ecological stewardship, and microbial cooperation, continually renewing itself through each generation's attentive practice and inherited cultural memory. The making of pulque begins long before any fermentation, with the cultivation, selection, and preparation of Maguey plants. These plants must be grown and maintained for many years before they yield anything. The transition to aguamiel production depends on a very specific sequence of plant development and human intervention, culminating in a daily harvesting routine. This triad captures how the metabolic potential of the plant is unlocked through purposeful disruption. The maguey used for pulque, especially agave salmiana, is not harvested until it reaches full maturity, typically between 8 and 12 years. During that time, it builds up a store of carbohydrates, mainly fructans, in its pinna. These sugars are not freely available. They are locked within the plant's tissues and only mobilized as the plant begins to flower. Farmers, or titlachiqueros, monitor the plant's growth closely. Indicators like leaf spread, central bulging, and the formation of a central bud signal that flowering is imminent. Without reaching this developmental stage, the plant will not produce aguamiel, even if physically cut. At the onset of flowering, a central stalk, the quiote, begins to grow. Left alone, it will shoot upward and trigger the plant's final reproductive phase. But in pulque production, the farmer intervenes. The quiote is cut before it fully emerges, typically using a machete or specialized blade. Then, over several days, the plant's central tissues are carefully scraped out to create a deep cavity known as the cajete. This process is delicate. It must wound the plant enough to induce sap flow, but not so aggressively as to kill it. The cavity is tended daily, scraped gently to prevent sealing, and protected with stones or leaves to deter insects and evaporation. This isn't a one-time act. It is the beginning of a ritualized, sustained interaction. Once the cajete is established and the plant responds, it begins to fill with a sweet, watery sap aguamiel. The plant now sees the cavity as a persistent wound and continuously secretes sap as part of its healing response. Farmers extract this liquid once or twice daily using an acocote, a long hollow gourd used like a siphon. The sap is then transferred to fermentation containers. A healthy maguey can yield aguamiel for up to 3 to 6 months, depending on how carefully it is tended. The rate and quality of sap production are influenced by daily scraping technique, climate, and plant condition. In this causal triad, the maguey's physiological maturity establishes the necessary conditions for human intervention. The flowering stalk, or quiote, signals readiness, inviting careful disruption by human hands. Yet maturity alone is incomplete. It must be engaged through a knowledgeable practice of timely cutting and delicate cajete formation. Once set into motion, this human-induced transformation reorients the plant's metabolism, channeling stored energy into a continuous secretion of aguamiel. Thus, the activation of aguamiel flow represents more than an agricultural technique. It embodies a dynamic interface between natural potential and practiced human skill. With aguamiel now flowing, the maguey's metabolic shift sets the stage for the daily rhythms of harvest and microbial activation that follow. With the maguey now producing aguamiel, the process moves into its most volatile phase, the daily harvest and fermentation of the sap. This is where the liquid begins to change character, first by being moved, then by being exposed. Fermentation doesn't begin in a lab or a sealed tank, but in the careful rhythms of collection, transfer, and interaction with the built microbial environment. This stage depends on both speed and intimacy. Sap that is fresh and warm from the plant is taken almost immediately into contact with the spaces and tools that will awaken its microbial transformation. At dawn and dusk, the tlachiquero returns to each productive plant, scrapes the cajete to stimulate fresh sap flow, and uses the acocote, a long hollow gourd, to draw out the aguamiel. This tool is not sterile. It is cleaned but remains part of the larger microbial ecosystem. The collected sap is poured into buckets or clay pots and transported, often by foot or donkey, to the tinacle or fermentation area. This is done swiftly. Aguamiel begins to change the moment it leaves the plant. As a liquid, aguamiel is rich in simple sugars like glucose, fructose, and sucrose, but also in more complex oligosaccharides and trace proteins that support microbial growth. It is slightly acidic, typically pH 5 to 6, with low buffering capacity, making it highly sensitive to microbial metabolism. While it may appear inert, it is a chemically reactive substrate primed for fermentation. Its biological potential is latent, but ready to be unlocked. Once the aguamiel is poured into fermentation vessels, traditionally made of wood, animal skins, or stone, it comes into contact with a living surface. These containers are rarely scrubbed clean. Instead, they are seasoned by years of use, harboring stable microbial communities in their cracks, fibers, and residues. A small amount of pulque from a previous batch may remain at the bottom of the container, seeding the new sap with active microbes. The moment aguamiel enters this space, microbial succession begins. Lactic acid bacteria already present from the vessel walls or the air begin to acidify the sap, while yeasts and ethanol-producing bacteria consume the sugars. Of particular importance is Zymomonas mobilis, a bacterium that ferments sugars via the Entner-Dudarov pathway, producing ethanol, carbon dioxide, and exopolysaccharides that increase viscosity. The ecosystem is self-starting. shaped by the proximity of the environment, the residues of prior fermentations, and the inherent properties of the sap itself. Within a few hours, the aguamiel begins to visibly ferment. Small bubbles form, the scent becomes sour and alcoholic, and the liquid thickens. The process continues for roughly 12 to 48 hours, though timing is not fixed. Tlachiquero or pulquero tastes and observes, too sweet and it is immature, too sour and it has passed its peak. The fermentation produces a drink that is mildly alcoholic, usually around 4 to 6%, tangy from lactic acid, and uniquely viscous due to microbial levain production. Fermentation is not simply a biochemical reaction here. It is a live phase of the system. The pulque is consumed while still fermenting, with a microbial load of over 1 million to 100 million cells per milliliter. Because of this, the product is ephemeral. It cannot be stored for long, and it changes character over the course of a day. The fermentation described here forms a reinforcing loop anchored in daily repetition and ecological continuity. Every harvested aguamiel batch nourishes and stimulates the microbial community residing within seasoned fermentation vessels, activating an intricate network of bacteria and yeasts that transform the sap into pulque. Crucially, each fermentation event does more than produce a consumable product. It enriches microbial memory, replenishes the microbial community, and conditions the vessels themselves. Thus, fermentation continuously strengthens the living infrastructure that makes future batches possible, forming a rhythmic cycle of renewal and growth. To understand how this cycle sustains itself, we next consider the unique stability offered by the fermentation environment itself, the tinacle. Fermentation doesn't take place in isolation. Once aguamiel is introduced into the system, it ferments not just because it contains sugars, but because it is placed within a space designed to host microbial transformation. That space is the tinacle, the traditional fermentation room or structure, where conditions are continually shaped to support the microbial community and guide the transformation of sap into pulque. In this triad, we look closely at the environmental substrate of fermentation and how practice architecture and microbial ecology come together to produce a stable and responsive system. Pulque fermentation is a fast-moving process, too fast in fact to allow for error. As aguamiel ferments, the microbial populations expand exponentially, transforming the sap within hours. But fermentation is not guaranteed by sugar content alone. It depends on the right combination of temperature, humidity, vessel condition, and microbial seeding. These conditions are maintained within the tinacle. Most fermentation is done in large open-mouthed containers, wooden barrels, ceramic pots, or animal skins, each of which offers different textures and porosities for microbial adhesion. The fermentation itself, as it proceeds, affects the environment. It releases carbon dioxide, warms the liquid, and alters pH, creating a niche suited to a specific succession of organisms. Each fermentation, in this sense, is not just a reaction, but a living event that shapes and is shaped by its surroundings. The tinacle is not sterile. It is a curated microbial zone. Usually a shaded enclosed area adjacent to the field or household, it may be constructed of adobe, stone, or wood. Its walls absorb moisture, and its air is thick with suspended microbial cells from years of fermentation. The tools inside it, acocotes, buckets, stirring paddles, are rarely washed with soap. Instead, they are rinsed or left to dry, preserving the thin layers of biofilm that form a sort of microbial starter culture. The layout of the tinacle often includes a sequence of vessels used for first, second, and final stage fermentation, allowing a controlled progression of microbial development. The space is not neutral. It is a constructed ecological zone maintained through routine material culture and a familiarity with what the space should feel and smell like when it's working properly. Over time, the tinacle develops a microbial memory, a relatively stable population of organisms adapted to both the environment and the process. Repeated exposure to aguamiel selects for organisms that can rapidly colonize fresh sap and outcompete spoilage microbes. Dominant players like Xenomonas mobilis, various lactic acid bacteria, and wild yeasts become established in the vessels and ambient surfaces. This stability is not genetic uniformity, it's ecological resilience. Even though the specific ratios of organisms may vary day to day, the functional structure of the community remains. Ethanol producers, acidifiers, and viscosity modulators recur predictably. These communities don't need to be artificially managed because they are sustained through daily reactivation, nutrient cycling, and spatial containment. The tinacle operates like a microbial commons, with each batch feeding back into the ecological architecture. This conjoined interaction reveals how the fermentation environment, or tinacle, simultaneously supports fermentation and maintains microbial stability. Far from being just a passive location, the tinacle embodies ecological memory. Its seasoned surfaces, stable microbial communities, and specific environmental conditions are actively maintained by daily fermentation processes. Each batch of fermenting aguamiel reinforces microbial communities and vessel conditioning, sustaining conditions for future fermentations. At the same time, stable microbial populations continuously renew the ecological identity of the tinacle itself. In this manner, pulque fermentation is not simply biochemical, but profoundly ecological, a system sustained by its capacity for adaptive memory, spatially embedded within a purposefully maintained environment. This interconnected balance between microbial ecology and human-built environment provides the foundation upon which human sensory expertise guides the pulque making process. By the time fermentation is underway in the tinacle, the system contains all the ingredients for transformation, but it still lacks control. The difference between a well-balanced pulque and a sour, spoiled batch lies in a series of active judgments, adjustments, and material interventions made by the producer. The fermentation system is not automated. It is felt, tasted, smelled, stirred, and watched. This triad highlights the harmonic interplay between the microbial life that drives fermentation, the human labor that stewards and times it, and the emergent quality of pulque as a product. No single factor is sufficient. Quality arises only when microbial and human agency are aligned. The microbial community responsible for fermentation is diverse, active, and sensitive to disturbance. It includes ethanol-producing bacteria like Zymomonas mobilis, various wild yeasts such as Saccharomyces cerevisiae and Candida spp, and lactic acid bacteria like Lactobacillus plantarum and Leuconostoc mesenteroids. These organisms interact in predictable but non-linear ways. Lab dominate the early phase, acidifying the environment and protecting against spoilage. As fermentation progresses, yeasts and Zymomonas take over, converting sugars into ethanol and producing the levains that give pulque its characteristic viscosity. But these successions are sensitive to temperature, sugar concentration, pH, oxygen levels, and time. A shift in one parameter, say a change in ambient heat or the rate of sap addition, can tilt the microbial balance toward unwanted organisms. In this way, the ecosystem is not just productive, but precarious, requiring ongoing stabilization. The pulquero or tlachiquero is not simply a collector or observer. They are a co-regulator of the fermentation. Their role involves a sequence of actions and decisions that steer the microbial community toward desired outcomes. These include the timing of aguamiel addition, the temperature of the fermentation space, the duration of fermentation, and the use or omission of starter cultures from prior batches. Stirring, covering, tasting, and smelling are all part of a daily sensory routine. In some cases, they may also selectively blend aguamiel from different plants to balance sugar profiles or acidity. These practices are rarely written down. They are learned by apprenticeship, guided by embodied knowledge of what good pulque should look, smell, and taste like. Human intervention is not a correction of nature. It is an alignment with microbial rhythm, a kind of symbiotic choreography. Pulque is evaluated not by laboratory standards but by sensory coherence. It should be slightly sweet, mildly acidic, low in alcohol but perceptibly fermented, and thick but drinkable. The mouthfeel is creamy, the flavor complex, sometimes with fruity or herbal notes depending on the agave, season, or even ambient microbiota. Over-fermented pulque becomes too sour, loses its viscosity, and separates into liquid and solids. Under-fermented pulque lacks body and aroma. These outcomes are not purely biological. They are emergent properties of the interaction between microbial metabolism and human adjustment. The quality of pulque is thus not fixed in chemical terms. It is defined relationally, in a way that includes microbial succession, spatial conditions, and human timing. This harmonic triad captures the nuanced interplay required to achieve quality pulque. Neither microbial ecosystems nor human practices alone guarantee successful fermentation. It is their sensitive alignment, shaped through careful sensory engagement, that ensures the drink's desired character emerges. Human expertise in tasting, smelling, stirring, and timing continuously negotiates with microbial dynamics, forming an active dialogue of biological and cultural knowledge. Pulque quality thus becomes an emergent property, defined not solely by chemical composition, but through the embodied experience of producers responding to microbial activity in real time. When this dialogue is successful, quality reinforces human practice and microbial continuity, informing subsequent fermentation cycles. Yet, even this skilled human microbial partnership relies ultimately upon deeper, long-term cultural commitments and ecological care, ensuring the entire system's continued regeneration. While pulque is made on a daily basis, the conditions that make it possible are cultivated across decades. Maguey plants take years to mature. Fermentation spaces must be maintained, knowledge passed down, and seasonal rhythms respected. This final triad focuses on the long-term homeostasis of the system, how ongoing pulque production depends not just on the availability of ingredients, but on sustained ecological care and cultural memory. It is here that the system shows its full pattern, not as a chain of isolated steps, but as a self-renewing field of relations. No pulque can be made without maguey, but not just any maguey, and not at any time. The plants used for pulque are slow-growing, requiring between 8 and 12 years before they are ready to produce aguamiel. During this time, they must be planted, spaced, weeded, and protected from pests, livestock, and erosion. In many communities, maguey is planted along terraces, roadsides, or field boundaries, serving both agricultural and ecological functions. Once mature, only one flowering cycle can be harvested. The plant dies afterward. Stewardship therefore includes not just individual plant care, but successional planting, ensuring that there will always be mature plants coming into readiness as others are spent. This work is invisible in a glass of pulque, but it is the ground upon which everything else depends. The knowledge of how to cultivate maguey, extract aguamiel, ferment pulque, and evaluate its quality is not formally codified. It is lived and inherited. In many pulque-producing communities, these practices are passed down within families or shared among neighbors. Tools like the acocote techniques for cajete preparation and methods for adjusting fermentation are all taught by doing. Cultural continuity also includes festivals, rituals, and market systems that provide social and economic support for pulque production. When these networks erode through migration stigma or industrial pressure, the practices that support maguey stewardship and fermentation begin to disappear. Without people to know and value the system, the knowledge and the plants both vanish. At the surface, this is the most visible element, pulque being served and consumed in homes, markets, or cantinas. But this daily product only exists as the outcome of long-term preparation and intergenerational care. It relies on both the availability of mature maguey and the presence of people who know how to harvest, ferment, and manage the process. Where production has been lost, through neglect of maguey fields, interruption of cultural transmission, or legal restrictions, the drink disappears almost entirely. Pulque is fragile, not because it is difficult to make, but because it is deeply entangled in a landscape of practices that are easy to disrupt and hard to restore. In this retrospective triad, ongoing pulque production reveals itself as fundamentally dependent upon sustained cultural continuity and dedicated ecological stewardship. Today's pulque emerges from yesterday's intentional care, generations of knowledge passed down, maguey carefully planted and maintained, and fermentation practices continuously adapted and refined. If these cultural bonds unravel, production halts, stewardship erodes, and the cycle falters. Conversely, as cultural valuation remains strong, it motivates continual ecological care, intergenerational transmission of knowledge, and stable pulque production. Thus, the daily act of producing pulque becomes an affirmation that cultural memory and ecological relationships remain intact, a sign that the long-term system, rooted in shared human practice and ecological wisdom, continues to thrive. Pulque is not merely a product, but an expression of resilience, reflecting the enduring vitality of a complex web of relationships connecting past, present, and future. Pulque is far more than a beverage. It is a living testament, a woven tapestry of relationships carefully maintained across generations. Each cup carries within it echoes of ancestral wisdom, whispers of microbial companionship, and traces of ecological commitment. It speaks of maguey plants patiently maturing under watchful eyes, of steady hands gently coaxing aguamiel from hidden depths, and of bustling microbial communities invisibly at work within the aged vessels of the tinacal. Yet the richness of pulque extends beyond taste and texture. Each sip connects the drinker with a deep reciprocal partnership forged over millennia. where humans do not merely control or exploit nature, but respectfully engage with it, learning its rhythms, responding to its signals, and co-creating meaning and sustenance from the Earth's abundance. Pulque production exemplifies the extraordinary intricacies of triadic interaction, the causal initiation of aguamiel, the reinforcing rhythms of microbial fermentation, the ecological memory conjoined within the tinacle, and the harmonic sensory dialogues that define its quality. But above all, it highlights a profound truth. To sustain something alive, truly alive, requires the dedicated preservation of cultural memory and ecological stewardship. This is the Pulque system's ultimate gift, and its ongoing challenge, the continual regeneration of relationships. As the drink is passed from hand to hand, from elder to youth, from fermentation vat to festive table, it reminds communities of their shared history and collective future. Pulque endures because the bonds that create it endure, binding people, plants, and microbes together in resilient harmony. Each day's harvest, each moment of careful fermentation, each vessel shared among friends or family, these seemingly small acts collectively reinforce a larger truth, that life, in its richest form, thrives not in isolation, but in the fertile soil of interconnectedness. Pulque remains an enduring living tradition precisely because it manifests this profound interdependency. Let us, therefore, savor Pulque not merely as consumers, but as participants in a timeless dance. Through its ephemeral presence, it quietly teaches us to cultivate humility, attentiveness, and reverence for the delicate yet resilient bonds that sustain all life. Bonds continually nurtured by each generation's committed